Leonard Nimoy spent 30 years being the most logical man in the galaxy. And then, in the middle of his career, he stepped off the bridge of the Enterprise, picked up a director's chair, and made the single highest-grossing movie in America for the entire year of 1987. It wasn't a space epic. It wasn't even science fiction. It was a comedy about three clueless bachelors and a baby that got left on their doorstep. That movie made more money than Beverly Hills Cop 2. It made more money than Fatal Attraction. And buried in the cast list, playing a grocery store clerk for a single day of work, was a 22-year-old comedian who would go on to co-found one of the most influential sketch comedy groups in television history. This week, that same comedian showed up in a Star Trek show, decades later, and told a story about the day Spock himself gave him a note on set. This is where a baby comedy, a haunted house myth, and Starfleet all collide. If you're new here, this is the channel where we take one strange little pop culture headline and pull every thread attached to it until the whole tapestry falls apart in a good way. Today's thread starts with a new episode of Star Trek Strange New Worlds, but it's going to take us through 80s Hollywood, a decades-old ghost story that terrified an entire generation of VHS renters, and a directing career that peaked spectacularly and then did not. Let's start with the man at the center of it. Not Spock, the other guy. Dave Foley just guest starred in Strange New World Season 4, and while promoting the episode, he was asked about something buried deep in his resume. Long before Kids in the Hall, long before news radio, back in 1987, a 22-year-old Dave Foley picked up a string of one-day acting gigs around Toronto. One of those gigs happened to be a small role as a grocery store clerk in a movie called 3 Men and a Baby. Here's the part that turns a throwaway credit into a genuinely great story. That movie was directed by Leonard Nimoy. Foley, by his own account, was already a serious Star Trek fan, so getting directed by the actual Spock on his first real film set was a massive deal for him. And Nimoy gave him a note after a take that Foley says has followed him around for his entire career since. Nimoy walked over and told him, simply, to go faster. Foley has said that note has come up more times in his working life than he can count. It's a small anecdote, but think about what it actually represents. A guy who spent the 60s playing the most restrained, controlled character in television history was, 20 years later, standing on a movie set telling actors to pick up the pace. Nimoy wasn't trying to relive Spock. He was trying to build comedic timing in a scene about a grocery store with a 22-year-old actor who had no idea he was about to spend the next 4 decades being a professional funny person. That's the kind of detail that never makes it into a Wikipedia page. But it's the kind of detail that tells you more about a person than any highlight reel could. That if the name Dave Foley doesn't immediately click, here's the fast version. He co-created and starred in Kids in the Hall, a sketch comedy show out of Canada that became a cult favorite and helped define an entire generation of alternative comedy. From there, he landed the lead role of Dave Nelson on news radio, playing the exhausted, straight-laced station manager surrounded by an absurd office full of coworkers. That show ran for 5 seasons and is still considered one of the sharpest workplace sitcoms of the 90s. Here's where it loops back to Star Trek in a way you might not expect. Foley has actually already been inside this franchise before. He voiced a Ferengi character named Parth in Star Trek Lower Decks. So walking onto the set of Strange New Worlds wasn't his first trip into this universe. It was his second. Except this time, it was live action in costume, on camera, decades after standing on a set being personally directed by the man who originated Vulcan logic on television. For a guy who has described himself as a genuine lifelong Star Trek fan, that's not just a job. That's closing a loop that started when he was 22 years old, holding a grocery bag prop, trying not to be starstruck in front of Spock. Now let's talk about the other side of this story, because Nimoy's directing career is genuinely one of the stranger arcs in Hollywood history. He didn't start out as a comedy director. His first time behind the camera was Star Trek III, The Search for Spock, a movie he took on partly because the studio dangled it as an incentive to keep playing the character. That film had to walk a tightrope, wrapping up a story that literally required killing off the crew's own captain's son, while setting up the next chapter. Critics generally agree Nimoy pulled it off by keeping the tone grounded instead of letting it collapse into melodrama. Then came Star Trek IV, The Voyage Home, the one where the crew time travels to 80s San Francisco to save humpback whales. It became a massive crossover hit, pulling in audiences who had never watched an episode of the original series. At that point, Nimoy had directed 2 Star Trek films in a row, and both had worked both critically and financially. So what does a director do after 2 science fiction hits? Apparently, pivot completely. Nimoy took on 3 Men and a Baby for Disney, a comedy with 0 spaceships, 0 aliens, and 0 logic-driven Vulcans. And it outperformed everything else that year, including 2 heavy hitters from Paramount, the very studio that had just released his own Star Trek films. Here's the part that rarely gets mentioned. That was basically the peak. After 3 Men and a Baby, Nimoy directed 3 more films: The Good Mother, Funny About Love, and Holy Matrimony. All 3 underperformed. Badly. His run as a bankable Hollywood director effectively started and ended within about 3 years, bookended by 2 Star Trek movies and 1 baby comedy. It's a genuinely unusual career shape. Most directors build up slowly. Nimoy hit his absolute commercial peak almost immediately, and then the industry moved on from him as a director, even while his fame as an actor never dipped. Now let's actually talk about 3 Men and a Baby, because the movie has a stranger legacy than most people realize. It's an American remake of a French film called Trois Hommes et un Coffin, and to this day it remains the highest-grossing remake of a French film in box office history. On a production budget of around $11 to $15 million, it pulled in over $167 million domestically, and once you count the international haul, the number climbs past $240 million. For a movie about 3 bachelors figuring out how to change a diaper, that is an enormous return. There's also a genuinely fun Star Trek Easter egg buried in the supporting cast. One of the actors in 3 Men and a Baby was Paul Guilfoyle. 33 years later, Guilfoyle showed up in Star Trek Discovery playing a character called Carl, who turns out to be a disguised version of the Guardian of Forever, one of the oldest and strangest pieces of Star Trek lore, dating all the way back to the original series. So the movie Nimoy directed quietly planted a seed that wouldn't pay off in the Star Trek universe for over 3 decades. And then there's the legend. If you were around in the early 90s, you probably remember this one, even if you didn't know the movie's name. About an hour into 3 Men and a Baby, there's a scene where Ted Danson's character and his mother walk through an apartment. In the background, behind a curtain, you can just make out what looks like a small figure standing perfectly still. Once the movie hit home video, a rumor exploded that the studio had accidentally filmed a real ghost, supposedly the spirit of a boy who had died in the house where the scene was shot. The story kept growing. Some versions claimed the boy's grieving mother sued the studio. Some claimed she went on national talk shows. None of it was true. The real explanation is almost funnier than the myth. That entire film was shot on a soundstage in Toronto. There was no actual haunted house because there was no actual house at all. The figure in the window was a cardboard cutout of Ted Danson's character in a top hat and tuxedo, a leftover prop from a scene involving a commercial his character was supposed to film, a subplot that got cut from the final version. Later in the movie, you can actually see the same cutout clearly, standing right next to Danson in a different scene, no curtain, no ambiguity. Disney's home video division confirmed the explanation publicly back in 1990. And yet, the story never fully died. Tom Selleck himself has been asked about it on television decades later, and even he's admitted the 2 images side by side are strange enough to keep the legend alive. So to recap, a baby comedy directed by Spock became the year's biggest hit, spawned a completely false haunted house rumor that spread for years before the internet even existed, and quietly connected to a Star Trek storyline that wouldn't air until more than 3 decades later. Which brings us back to the present. The episode that sparked this whole story is called Human Best Friend, the 3rd episode of Strange New Worlds Season 4. The setup is straightforward on paper. The crew finally gets a proper shore leave on a planet built entirely around relaxation and fun. Naturally, it goes wrong. Several crew members wake up with no memory of what happened the night before, which puts Scotty and Ortegas in the position of piecing together a very hazy timeline while the rest of the ship deals with the fallout. If that setup sounds familiar, critics have pointed out it borrows the structure of a certain hungover buddies comedy, just with a Starfleet uniform on. Dave Foley plays Dendrew, described by Foley himself as a kind of geeky resort host, dressed in loungewear, whose entire purpose is making sure every guest on the planet is having the time of their life. Think less alien overlord more overly enthusiastic activities coordinator who happens to run an entire planet. Early reviews have singled out the episode for leaning fully into comedy without losing what makes the show work. And there's apparently a standout scene involving Rebecca Romijn's character singing a Bonnie Tyler classic translated into Klingon, which is exactly the kind of detail that tells you this episode isn't trying to be a serious, brooding hour of television. For Foley, stepping into this world in live action carries a bit of extra weight. He's already voiced a character in Lower Decks, but appearing on screen in costume inside the franchise he grew up loving closes a loop that technically started decades earlier on a Toronto film set. Standing across from the man who gave him a note that stuck with him for the rest of his career, so next time someone tells you a random detail on their resume doesn't matter. Remember this one. A single day of work as a grocery store clerk on a movie most people only remember because of a cardboard cutout mistaken for a ghost ended up connecting a comedy legend to Starfleet for the rest of his career. If you like pulling on this thread with me, there are plenty more like it around this channel, so stick around and subscribe if you want to keep digging. I'll see you in the next one.